Hello, everyone. This is the Broken Christian Man podcast. My name is Scott. The show is about what it's like to be a Christian in the real world. Topics that we may or may not agree on, but we still need to talk about them to find a path forward and to better understanding each other so that we can live more Christian lives. If you're interested in this kind of a show, tune out to the world, tune in to what we're talking about, and let's see if we can influence each other in a positive way.
I'm Evelyn Hollis, and I was born in 1939.
Yeah. What was church life like in 1939?
It was a big deal. Everybody dressed in their hats and their finest dress and their white gloves, and you wanted to look your best. And it was just a really big deal. Men wore their suits and neckties and everything, and everybody nearly went. A lot of people, if you didn't go, act like something was wrong with you or you were hiding something. It was good and it was bad. It was good that they went all out for the Lord, but it hurt the people who didn't have the finest clothes to wear. Sometimes it kept them from going to church.
So it was very appearance orientated.
It was. But the preachers were more fire. Then they teach about, going to hell a lot more than they do now. They talked about salvation at every sermon. You always had an invitation, which sometimes we don't now.
Oh, so they didn't do an altar call, or they did an altar call after every sermon?
Yes, they sure did. On Sunday and Sunday night and Wednesday night. Well, anytime you went, they would be an altar call.
And if I remember right, it was pretty common to have church on Sunday night, and Wednesdays.
That's right. And there used to be a thing called, I don't know if I could think of the name. It's been so long ago, but where you met and you had a book that you did little parts. Everybody took a little part in it, and not everybody in the church, but certain people were assigned. But they don't have that anymore. It's phased out, but I can't remember what they called it. It's been too long ago.
Now, was there a lot of church division in that time?
No, not as much back then.
What kind of choices did you have for church?
Well, in town where I first started going to church, they had about everyone. They had a Baptist, Christian, Assembly of God, Church of Christ, and a Kingdom Hall, and Church of the Nazarene.
Oh, so they actually had a Kingdom Hall for, like, the Jehovah's Witnesses.
They did.
Was that, what was that like, for everybody? Because that's actually a pretty radical religion, and it should have been probably fairly a newer religion at that time.
Well, I never went there because I don't know what it was like. I didn't think that they're thinking, I knew what their beliefs was because I had a neighbor, and I didn't agree with any of their teachings about that. But I don't know, I wasn't raised in church, and I got to pick what church I wanted, and I went to several, seeking the right thing, what the Bible said. And I chose to be a Baptist, Southern Baptist church, because I agreed with it, and it more was fully united with the Bible.
Now, growing up, when you were growing up, you didn't go to church?
No, I didn't, because we lived out in the country, and you took a wagon everywhere you went then. And it was just, we had several kids in our family, and it was just not feasible. If it had been closer, we might have went, but I doubt we would, because my mom and dad didn't agree on what religion to go to. my dad was raised, his mother was Assembly of God, and my mother's mother believed in the Christian church and their doctrine. So all those kids got to pick what religion we wanted to and all of us were saved, I'm thankful to say, out of the 9.
What was school like?
One-room schoolhouse, big belly pot stove in the middle of it to keep it warm in the wintertime. And you walked there every day. It was 2.5 miles there and 2.5 miles back. And you went no matter what. If it was raining, you had a raincoat and boots, you put it on. Summer, it was out in May, and it resumed back in August. And I liked school. It was very interesting.
Now, when did it get, I remember you telling me whenever that you would go to school that then there was sports and there was cheerleaders.
No, not in my first 8 grades. In this one-room schoolhouse, there wasn't.
I see.
That was high school.
So your formative year, or your small years were in a one-room schoolhouse, and then
up to the 8th grade.
And then you went on to high school.
In the town. This was a country school, and then they mixed up later, and they got buses and stuff. And you went to the city school then after you was in the 8th grade.
It's not too different than how school is nowadays.
Yes, except whenever I was out of the 8th grade, they hadn't run the buses yet, and they hadn't consolidated the schools, so there was no way to go except you had to get a ride or ride a horse, which was very hard to do.
How far was school at that point from you?
5 miles.
So that would have been quite a trek to try to walk.
Yeah, you couldn't have done it in the wintertime at all. And it would wear you out, going back and forth every day, 5 miles on a gravel road.
And on the farm that you lived, did you guys raise any cattle or any kind of livestock?
Oh, yeah. Yes, we did. We had cows and horses and chickens and pigs.
Now, was any of that for profit, or was all of that to maintain the household?
Well, when I was very young, it was for profit. That's what you made, because there wasn't hardly any jobs. Because that was right after the Depression, the Great Depression. And later, Roosevelt started a work program building roads, and it was called the WPA, and my dad got a job on that, and that's the first time that he worked out anywhere, was on that.
And that, being on a road crew, that took him away from home.
Well, not at the beginning on WPA, but later when WPA ended, which it did, then it helped him to get a job on Frisco Railroad, and that's whenever he would be sometimes away from home.
So was there any religion in your family structure, or was it just kind of left out?
It was left out because they both agreed not to try to teach us kids their religion, what they believe, but my mom was pretty good about giving us quotes and saying, my mother told me this,
Yeah, I know, like, some of the really quotes that I came to live by was, God's not going to give you more unless you're happy with what you got, and some of those things that really played into my work ethic as I got older.
Well, also that's where she believed that you should treat others, that you'd have them treat you, and don't do anything to somebody else you wouldn't want done to you.
Right, the golden rules of
life.
So it's fair to say she probably did a highlight kind of teaching style from the Bible. She still highlighted the value system of the Bible, but just kind of disguised it as something else.
yeah, it's always was. This is what my mother told me. You know.
So,
taught, I guess is the correct word for that. But that's where I learned most of my ethics, I guess.
You learned a lot from Grandma. You went through school, and when did you meet my dad?
I met him when I went out to work at Dixon. I worked in a restaurant there, and the soldiers from Fort Leonard Wood would come over there and get a hotel room for the weekend just to get away from the post. And I met him really in the movie theater. And I don't remember when it was or nothing, but I just know that's where we met, was in a movie theater. He was sitting behind me, pestering me.
That sounds about like Dad.
Yeah.
So what was, married life is a whole lot different now than it is back in that time frame. What was the divorce rate like then compared to now?
It's practically zero. Back then you didn't get a divorce. You got married, you was married. Hardly ever did you hear of anybody getting a divorce. Actually, the worst thing could happen to you was if your husband got killed or you was left a widow with children to raise. It was very hard to have any money coming in where you had to go out and go to work because there was no daycares, there wasn't anything.
What about the welfare program? Was that in place at that time?
Well, there was a place where at that time you could draw child aid, which wasn't very much a month, but a lot of people, that's all they had.
If you were renting, what was the average price that you would pay to rent an apartment?
Probably around $35 or $40.
And that's a week or a month?
No, a month.
And what was the average wage?
Well, let's see. It was 75 cents an hour for a long time back then. I know it wasn't very much. I'd have to sit down and add it up, but for 75 cents an hour for 8 hours wasn't much. But it was enough that you could buy groceries, pay your rent, and maybe have a car payment.
What did a car go for?
Oh, goodness, I don't know if I can really remember. I know it wasn't much. First car we bought was a 37 Chevrolet, I believe. And I think we gave $300 for it.
Was that new or used?
It's used.
So I guess it's almost fair to say that a brand new car would be around $600 to $1,000.
Well, yeah, later. I think the Model T Ford was the first one come out. But I don't know. I think I remember reading someplace that it would cost around $4,000 for a brand new one. But that was a little bit before this, when that came out.
So, swinging back around to raising kids and the whole marital, dynamic in that time frame.
It was very simple. You stayed home and raised your children, and your husband worked and brought the money home. And that was back, then, before women started working out so much, except for World War II, whenever they had to, really, all the women had to go out and make weapons. That's where Rosie the Riveter came into play, whenever women had to make the ammunition and stuff. And that was really a hardship on the nation. If you didn't have an older parent at home to keep your kids, you was just up a stump.
So what would actually happen in that situation?
Either an aunt or someone else's grown daughter would babysit for you, like a cousin or something. They would step in, but families were a lot closer then, and they lived closer together where that could be. they really helped each other out with whatever situation, that was there. You always had neighbors that helped you out.
An interesting point there that comes to mind to me is like a mental illness and things like that. It doesn't seem like it was really researched or looked into at all.
No, you just took care of whoever it was and kept them at home and took care of them. There was no nursing homes back then. There was no mental institution unless you were, like a criminal. Then they would send you off to a criminal insane asylum.
What about children with mental illnesses?
Nothing usually happened. The parents took care of them and kept them at home. But most kids weren't. If they were, it would be like mentally challenged or something like that.
So more learning disability versus something like, say, Down syndrome?
Well, syndrome are not really that hard to take care of children like that. They're usually happy children, and they're not hard to take care of.
I guess kind of put Down syndrome in the category mental illness, but, just children, I should say a better way of phrasing that is children with special needs.
Well, the parents were the caregivers of it, and of course you can take them to the doctor, but they didn't have any facilities for that. You had what you had.
How did the church treat children with special needs?
Well, I don't know exactly because I really, in my childhood, I don't know how they was because I didn't go. But when I was going to church, they had a little Sunday school class for children with special needs, and they had a teacher just like the other people did in Sunday school. And you taught them what you could. It's according to how much they could absorb.
And also, like, with today's culture, did you see more compassion possibly amongst everyone than how people are today, where they're kind of in their own world and they just kind of...
Yeah, they don't have time for it. Although we do have, really, at my church, we have some children with special needs. And they have a lot of compassion and love. This one woman's been teaching them for a long time. And they do well. But, our church is small, so we're not a big church. I don't know how the big churches manage it, but I'm sure they got a place for them to go and learn as much as they can.
What would you say is like the biggest hardship that you see from then to today that was just a big part of life? You couldn't escape it. And how did you overcome that, or how did you deal with the hardship?
Well, you just dealt with it day by day like we do now. You went to school, you come home, did your chores, and my chores and my little sister's chores were to shell corn for the chickens. We had a gallon bucket. We had to shell enough corn, and a gallon of corn every night, and feed the chickens. And usually there was big families then. Boys usually was responsible for carrying wood in and, getting the wood. Then as time went on, you learned how to milk the cows or go get the cows was a big deal. Early in the morning, say 5:30, you'd go get those cows and get them up to the barn so you could get them milked. And that was a scary thing for children. They had to go out in the field. If they didn't come up the night before and put them in the barn lot and they let them back out, then you had to go bring them in.
So to go out in the dark, and you had to go bring the cows in the dark, huh?
Well, you had a flashlight or a lantern, and it got, in the summertime it got daylight early. The wintertime was really the hard time. It was cold.
Well, then you grow up in a house without running water. You had an outhouse.
Uh-huh. And that was very cold, too.
So what was some of the things that actually scared you? You know, like you're out in the middle of nowhere. You know, you have an outhouse you have to actually go outside to get to, or you have to do things in the dark. Was there any wives' tales or any kind of stories?
Oh, yeah, there was a lot of old stories, but I don't know. I didn't put too much stock in a lot of that stuff because a lot of it's just wild tales. I don't really remember being scared of animals because they were sightings of animals, but they were scared of you as you was of them. I really wasn't a person that was afraid in the dark, to tell you the truth, as long as I had a flashlight. As you go singing, you'll scare them all away.
Mm-hmm. So, when you got into, you know, later in life, what drew you to finding God? How did you have your path to thinking that there's more out there?
When I married your dad, his mother and them, they always went to church, but their church was close enough they could walk back and forth. And she's the one that clued me in on, you know, there was more. And I was very interested in it because I always knew there was something else more than just what we thought there was. Because I had heard stories of kids that went to Sunday school and they would tell you all this stuff about Jesus gave his life in John 3:16 for our sins. And I thought, well, it could be true, but it could be a fairy tale like the Three Little Pigs or something. So we wasn't too sure if it was true or not, but I found out it was true.
How did you come to that truth?
Through the Bible.
And what about the Bible spoke to you that it's true?
Well, it just made sense. I knew we did not descend from monkeys. I don't know why, but I just knew that we did not descend from monkeys, and we weren't from outer space. We were created, and I felt like there's more to this than what's being told. And the Bible tells us, you know, what happened. So
it actually had a complete story that made sense, that had a beginning and an end to it. So it really made more sense than, say, a fairy tale book that you kind of know it's just a fairy tale book.
Well, I always knew there was something more powerful than us. At first, I thought it was probably from outer space. That was my first guess.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I thought we probably do have aliens. But I thought, well, if they were going to harm us, they would have already harmed us. So I wasn't really scared of them. But I found out that's not true. That wasn't the higher power that I was looking for. The Bible made more sense of how we became into being than anything I'd ever read or looked at.
And going to church with my, grandparents, and what was that like? I know that they were hard shell Baptist, and it was a lot different than the preaching, missionary Baptist, but that's a lot different preaching than we see on the TV today for the most part.
Well, Roy's uncle was a preacher, and he preached at this little church. And first time I went to church, I was scared to death because he was pounding and shouting and, pounding on the pulpit and I wasn't understanding what he was saying. After a while, they talk so loud and, get their voice going that you can't always understand what they're saying. And when we left church, I said, what in the world was that preacher mad about? And Roy said, well, he wasn't mad. I said, yes, he was. His face was all red, and he was shouting and pounding on the pulpit. And he said, no, that's the way preachers are. And I thought, well, I didn't like it very much. I thought there's got to be a better way of getting people saved than that, if that's what he was doing, preaching. So I would kind of I wanted to into a quieter type of church life where you could understand what the preacher was saying instead of shouting and, the pounding and I don't know, but they were really good people and they meant well. It was just their style. And I later understood it, but I still would rather have a preacher that talked where I could understand what he's saying. I think you can make a good point if you'll calm down and just say what you're saying in a calmer voice. And that's whenever I, started trying to learn about the church by asking his mother questions. And she was always ready to do that, because she wasn't happy because he had married an unsaved person. So she did everything in her power to show me and to give me the information that I needed. But we didn't live close together. We lived in Missouri and they lived in Arkansas, and so we only saw them, on visits down there after we were married. So, and a few times we have tried living in Arkansas, but it didn't work out. They had even less work in Arkansas than they did in Missouri. So you're better off to be close to Fort Leonard Wood because they had more work for you to find here.
So, at this time you've learned about Christ. You're in your 20s.
I was 21 when I was saved.
And what was it like bringing, you see how times change. So then you get into a little bit of a liberal movement in the 60s. And then you get into the free love movement in the 70s. How did you see the church change? Did it curl up and kind of swat at the movement, or did it try to find a way to reach those kids?
They tried to find a way, but they were very rebellious, and they weren't interested. They wanted to be free, and, when the teenagers get in a certain part of their life, they want to pull away from their parents and establish their own self, what they think and what they believe. And it was just a movement, and it like everything else, it died down, The Beatles came on the scene, and that was a big deal. And they're all right. I enjoyed listening to them. They were good singers, and I don't know really if they were religious or not, but I know everybody loved them.
Yeah, Elvis comes to mind, and the ruckus that started, with rock and roll. And
it did. And everybody loved Elvis. He was a king. So they thought.
And that must have been really a big topic for the church at the time, because they were very appalled at his music and his bravado more than anything.
Yes. And his concerts, they were something else. I never went to one, but I didn't really want to either.
Why's that?
I just thought it would be too much. And, all the crowding and the way he moved and everything. And then girls were screaming and falling over. And I thought, no, I'd rather watch it on TV. I didn't want to be there.
So as you're moving along and life is changing, and whenever it came time, like, with my dad serving in the military and being in the Korean War, or not the Korean.
Yes, it was.
It was the Korean. And how were you reconciling being married to a military man?
Oh, I loved it. They had everything already shaped up in their life. They learned how to obey orders. They were men. They weren't just young boys.
Now, did you live on base at any time?
No, we didn't, but we lived off base, a short distance away. from the base, and by then we had a car, and he drove back and forth. When we got married, I stayed with my parents, and he come over on weekends until it got to where he could live off base.
Would the military provide lodging for married couples?
They give you a living allowance for living off the post, yes. And you had medical benefits.
So that must have been kind of odd to have that probably for the first time in your life.
Well, it was, but I never did ever use it. Because he was drafted and he was only in there for 2 years. But he had to be in the National Guard after he was out of the Army for 6 years. And that meant you could be called up at any time they needed you. You had to go.
Did that kind of have an air of fear to it?
Yes, it did. Not only for me, but also for him too, because on a minute's notice, sometimes you can't get everything the way you want it to be if you have to leave. And he was the only provider at that time.
So, from the time that you didn't really actually have much of a teenage years kind of reference for church.
No.
But you had my sisters, and you had a reference there for church and raising daughters.
I took my kids when Kathy was 3 months old the first time I took her to church. That's my oldest daughter.
How was the church then about having, how did it change for child rearing in the 70s, 60s and 70s? Did it seem to get stricter, or did it seem to be more helpful with more counsel with all of the things that's going on to try to give you direction on how to raise kids in that era?
Mm-hmm. It sure did. My kids were always in Sunday school. They took part in the church service. A lot of times Kathy would sing a special with her friend. And actually when they got into their teenagers, that's when they didn't want to go anymore, because then it was boring. But they came back to it later,
So what's the main difference that you see in young couples in the church today to how it was whenever you were raising children?
Well, you could always count on the school not having any activities, Boy Scouts or whatever. On Sunday, you didn't have no ball practices. On Wednesday night, they kept that off, and your kids were always ready to go. They didn't have other obligations like they do now. They have so many activities they got, and they have them all the time, even on Sundays. They don't take time out for anything. School activities becomes their God at the time.
So do you feel like that we've got to keep our kids busy to keep them out of trouble? Do you feel like it's a little bit of an overload on the kids today to where they really can't find their faith, find a way to get closer to God because they've got all this other stuff going on all the time?
Well, I think a little bit of sports is good, but keep up your regular family life and take your children to church and set a pattern for them. Give them something to fall back on. A lot of kids don't have anything. They don't know anybody loves them, because a lot of times their mothers and fathers both work, and they spend time alone, or they spend it in sports. Sad to say that the youth is very little in churches now, not like it used to be. We had a whole bunch of kids in school when the girls were little, and actually when you were little too. Mm-hmm. There was quite a few kids in the youth group. Well, we got maybe 6 now. We used to have a lot more.
As you look through your life up to this point, how have you seen your faith and your belief in Jesus, and how have you seen that impact your life?
Well, I don't know what I would have done and got through many hard times if I didn't have the faith that God would help me through it. And He would take care of what He said. He will take care of His own. And that was what you had. You had to go by faith for day to day, and I still do that today. You live each day, one day at a time, and then try to get through that day. And that's the way I've always done it. With my kids, I've taught them to do that. Take everything one day at a time. Don't try to look at your whole future, because you can never plan anything. God has a plan for your life. And if you try to pray and stay close to God and ask Him, show me what you want me to do. What path do you want me to take? And then listen to Him. After you pray, the biggest thing people do is get up and go on. As soon as they pray, well, I'm done. Don't leave immediately. Sit there and listen for a while. Sometimes God will speak to your heart.
So, something I really wanted to touch on that I found really intriguing is we're all the way through it now, but we had the pandemic with COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And you actually lived through the polio epidemic.
Oh, yeah. That was to me, was worse, I thought, than COVID. Because you couldn't go. I mean, the mothers were so fearful. They didn't know how. A lot of them didn't know. If you lived on a farm, you didn't know how the kids were catching it. We knew it spread from one kid to another. But, I mean, we couldn't even go play in the creek because water was supposed to, sometimes you could get it in the water. Well, we only had a creek to swim in. We didn't go to a pool and swim with other people. But she wouldn't even let us go play in the creek, and nobody was swimming in it and walking in it except the cows. So that would have been, something we could have done, but she was real fearful, and you had to stay home. And older people went on to church, but the children were mainly kept at home because that was a place of contact where you could become infected with it.
So what are some similarities that you had seen by how we had treated the COVID pandemic in comparison to how you treated the polio epidemic?
Well, I don't think that they shut down businesses over it. They might have, mainly they thought of children as the ones who would get polio, but grown-up can get it too. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt, our once president, he had polio and he was paralyzed. And he was president. He went on and became president. And he was 34, I think, when he got his, and he was in his 30s. And that was unusual for somebody that old to get polio, but it was a horrible disease, and it could paralyze you in 3 or 4 different ways. They was, a spinal kind and a brain kind, and another that wasn't too severe. So the ones that had got paralyzed, they couldn't even breathe, they would take them someplace and put them in a sanitarium, they called them back then, and they had breathing places they had to have to help them breathe, and it was called an iron lung. And that wasn't with their parents, and, of course, their parents could go and see them until, and look through the window and stuff, but until they got past a certain stage, you couldn't go and see your children. It was very scary. Everybody was really terrified. I didn't see that with the COVID. I mean, plenty of people were overly frightened of it, but I just think that you do what you can to get through it, and God will give you the courage and the grace to get through it, but just keep on doing what you're doing. Take it day by day. And if the church is closed down, that don't mean you can't watch, the TV. That's what I did when the churches were closed. But they didn't make you wear a mask then because I guess they hadn't thought of it if you were out in public. But living on a farm, a lot of people left the cities and bought farms just to get their kids out in the country and away from other kids.
Yeah, that was a similar happening with the COVID vaccine. A lot of or not vaccine, COVID vaccine, but COVID. A lot of people left the cities and went and lived in the country trying to escape it, I guess. So that was something that similarly happened during the polio epidemic.
Well, I know we had something back then, and we still have it today. It's called the March of Dimes. And President Roosevelt started that. Sending 10 cents to, it would give you an address, and every dime you got, you saved it back to send to the March of Dimes. And that was for them to do research and find out what could they get a vaccine. And they did get a vaccine, I think in 56. Jonas Salk got one, but people didn't react at all to the polio vaccine like they did the COVID vaccine. They were so thankful to God that there was a vaccine to get. You rushed out and got it as soon as you could. You didn't have all this stuff, going on. Like, should I take the shot or should I not take the shot? But we trusted our government back then more than we do now. Because actually, I think the government did look after us better back then. They had the best for us that they wanted. I don't know now if it's that way or not. I ain't going to say because I'm not really sure. Some of them do, and some of them are not. They're in it for the money. And I guess that's always been, but I just think it was better back then because you could trust the government. And it was like a celebration whenever he discovered that polio vaccine. It was like everybody was celebrating. And I didn't see that during the COVID.
And we have, as a society, become a lot more skeptical of our leaders.
Mm-hmm.
How, through the polio vaccine, how did that help? What did that do to you as, because this happened when you were a child, right?
Yeah, I was a teenager whenever that polio vaccine was discovered.
Did it come off like the boogeyman kind of scenario? Like
no.
There's this disease out there and we don't know what's causing it.
Well, we were scared of polio. We weren't scared of the vaccine. We were just thankful to God that they found a vaccine for it. So people could, and everybody wanted a vaccine. You stood in line.
So with that being said, in the time frame now to the time frame, from then to now, what are the biggest differences in church life and belief? What are the biggest differences that stand out to you that are different from that time to now?
Okay. Well, I think the biggest deal is that people can go casual to church nowadays. You can wear even jeans or cargo shorts to church, and you would never done that back in the 50s. You dressed up, and you would not, and women nearly all wear slacks now to church. You would have never done that in the 50s. You had to have a dress. And the preaching is not as centered on the salvation as much as it used to be. Billy Graham always preached on salvation, and he did it year after year for I don't know how many years, but that was always the main point he was on, was salvation. He wasn't up there nitpicking about other things. He just wanted to get everybody that could to get them saved and then go join their local church and start going to church. And there's no telling how many people that were saved during his crusade time. Nowadays we have preachers that are afraid to preach on anything and make a stand about something because somebody's going to get offended in the congregation, and he's going to get a tongue lashing over it later after the service for preaching on some of the new stuff that's come into being right now. They just preach what God told them to preach, and nowadays you can buy sermons you don't even have to think of. Well, I don't call that preaching when you're preaching somebody else's sermon that they thought of. God should tell you what to preach, and every church would be different. The same sermon wouldn't work in every church. But if it comes from God, He will have them preach on things that church needs to hear.
Kind of like how Paul did whenever he wrote his letters to the different churches.
That's right. Each church he wrote a different letter to.
If you had a book in the Bible that you would say is your favorite, which one would it be?
Well, I kind of favor Proverbs the best.
Why is that?
Because there's a lot of good advice in there for anybody of any age. There's a lot of good books in the Bible, but I think I learned the most out of Proverbs than I did anywhere else. But for a beginning Christian, you need to learn about God's love and how God's love saved us through His Son. And the four Gospels will tell you that story of what He done to save our souls so we could go into heaven if we only believed in Him. We don't have to do nothing, and we can make many mistakes, which everybody does all the time. If you just confess your sins and accept that He is God's Son, you can be saved, and you can be sure of your salvation because nobody can take it away from you. And God tells you that in 1 John. Nobody can snatch you out of His hand, because when you're saved and the Holy Spirit comes into your life, He seals you, and they can't break that seal. You may wander away and get tempted, but you'll always come back and confess most of the times.
You said that Proverbs is probably your favorite book. What is your favorite message in Proverbs?
I can't quote you a lot out there right now, but you can find what you're looking for once you thumb to it. I think, it's a good book to read before you get married and a good book to read after you're married. And I think 1st and 2nd Peter is a very good book for husbands and wives to read. Tells you how to treat your wife and how to treat your husband, how to be there for each other, which I don't see a lot of that anymore. It's me. I come first. And that's not right. I think that we're equal partners in this thing called getting through life, and we have to be there for each other. And sometimes one's down and the other can lift them up, or vice versa. You can always find something to be thankful for.
On the topic of marriage, what would be your biggest advice to give to people who are married?
Well, I think you should talk everything over before you make a decision. And in my case, we talked it over. But in the end, my husband, what he thought, I felt like God was leading him. And I would usually give in, even though sometimes I didn't agree with him. But it turned out what he was doing was the right thing. So I think the man is the head of the house, the man is underneath God, and God will speak more to the man than He does to the woman. And then the man should talk things over with his wife, and then together make a decision and pray about it. That's the main thing. Just pray about your decision before you go and do something, or go in debt, or whatever it is you're thinking about doing, or moving to a different place, or whatever. You should think it over. Talk to each other about it. And then you have to come together and make a final decision.
What advice would you give to young people nowadays?
I think if you would put your phone down and spend an hour with God and pray and ask Him, what plan do you have for my life? And then listen to Him. The Bible, if you're familiar with it, if you're not, you need to get familiar with it. So God can lead you. If you don't know what His Word said, He can't lead you. And if you're not His child, sometimes it's very difficult to read the Bible, because I know before I got saved, it was all looked like Greek to me. But after you study it a little bit, it becomes clearer, and God will open your eyes. And a lot of times He will speak to you through His Word.
Thank you, Mom. I appreciate you. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. So
okay.
I hope everyone has a good day. Thank you for listening, everybody. If you like the content that you heard today, please go to wherever you get your podcasts and leave a rating. I'd love to get a 5-star rating, but also like to get a genuine rating so we know how we're doing. Anyway, thank you for your time today, and we'll see you next time.